The alarm didn't sound like an alarm. It was more like a whisper, a low hum that crept through the walls of the mining shaft and settled into your bones before your brain registered it. Ryker Vale was already awake when it hit. He'd been lying on a cot made of welded scrap, staring at the ceiling. Around him, 40 workers stirred in a room the size of a cargo hold, because that's essentially what it was. The Duvas colony was a repurposed Zerelian transport shell bolted to a ridge of copper-rich rock under two purple suns. The overseers called it a labor settlement. Everyone else called it what it was, a cage with better lighting. The hum turned into a tone. Ryker knew that tone. He'd heard it once before in a story his guardian told him when he was 12. A story about signals, old signals, Earth signals. The kind buried so deep in dead satellite networks that no council scanner could ever find them. He was already moving toward the wall panel. A cracked comm receiver hidden behind a ventilation grating he'd installed himself 14 months ago, piece by piece from the overseer's supply room. He pressed his ear to the speaker. The tone resolved into fragments, pulses, old Earth binary wrapped in layers of encryption so thick that even Ryker barely recognized the shape of it. But he recognized the core. 2 words, over and over. It is time. A woman appeared behind him. Sable. She'd been on Duvas 3 years, and she had a face that didn't show much unless she wanted it to. "What does it say?" she asked. He turned around. "It says it's time." She stared at him. Time for what? Everything? That was the night Ryker Vale stopped waiting. He was born on this dust ball. His mother died before he was old enough to remember her face. He had exactly 1 photograph, blurry, sun-bleached. A woman with dark eyes and a jaw set like she was bracing for impact. He kept it folded inside the lining of his boot, the only piece of her he had. The man who raised him wasn't his biological father. He was a former Earth engineer named Dorn who'd survived the purges by pretending to be something he wasn't. A maintenance tech. A loyal laborer. A human who had learned the particular posture of someone who is not a threat. Dorn was very good at that posture. He practiced it for years, but at night, when the overseer's shift ended and the dormitory went quiet, he dropped it. Dorn didn't teach Ryker how to mine copper. He taught him history, real history, the kind the Council had been erasing for decades. He talked about the bombardment, about the day the Council cracked Earth's mantle and called it a stability event, about the orbital cities they burned, the colonies they scattered, the generations herded into work camps on moons so obscure they didn't even have proper names in any registry. He talked about how humanity had gone from cracking dark matter compression to mopping floors in alien stations, all in 80 years. "They think we broke," Dorn used to say. But there's a difference between breaking and bending. He had a phrase he used at night, just before Ryker would finally fall asleep. He'd lean in close and say it low, like a prayer. "We don't win because we're stronger. We win because we refuse to stay broken." Ryker had carried those words for 26 years. He'd carried them through the copper shafts, through the mornings when overseers walked the dormitory aisles and everyone sat up straight and looked at nothing. Through the years of learning the Zerelian bureaucratic system from the inside, piece by piece, the way you learn the architecture of a cage. Through Dorn's death, 4 years ago, from a lung condition that Council medical policy classified as not worth treating in human laborers. He'd carried them right up to this moment, standing in front of a hidden comm receiver in the dark. Now the signal had arrived. He spent 3 days gathering people, small increments, maintenance corridors, shift changes. He talked to the ones he'd been watching for months. The kind who flinched a half-second too late when overseers yelled. The kind who were performing submission, not feeling it. He found 11 of them. They met in the lowest level of the abandoned titanium vein. The Zerelian sensors didn't bother scanning below the 3rd subterranean level. Why would they? Who was going to organize in a human mining colony? A man named Kress, broad-shouldered and quiet, with a scar from his left ear to his collarbone, spoke first. "Even if the signal is real, what do 11 people do on a rock colony in the middle of nowhere?" "We stop pretending," Ryker said. And we start building. Nobody asked what they were building. They already knew. The overseers disappeared on a Tuesday, not through a firefight. Ryker had spent 6 weeks quietly disabling the communication relay one component at a time. When it went down, they panicked. When they panicked, they made mistakes. When they made mistakes, they were alone. By Thursday morning, Duvas 3 was a human colony. 47 people stood in the central bay and stared at each other like they'd forgotten what breathing without someone watching felt like. Sable looked at Ryker. What now? He was already dismantling the Overseer's terminals. Now we strip this station and we move. They took the docked supply cruiser. It smelled like burned coolant and old machinery, but it flew. And when it broke through the thin atmosphere of Duvas 3, Ryker stood at the forward viewport and watched the purple suns shrink behind him. He hadn't seen stars in 3 years. He cried, just once, just briefly. Then he turned back to the navigation terminal. The target was a moon called Veltrax 9, frozen Communications Heavy Council maintained. It housed a relay hub that, according to intelligence Ryker had been receiving in fragments for a year, was key to broadcasting the rebellion beyond what the Council could suppress. There was also something else at Veltrax, a source. Someone feeding information to scattered resistance cells for over a decade. The kind of intelligence that required real Council-level access. The source had a name Ryker had heard once in an encrypted fragment 6 months ago, Cipher. He didn't know who Cipher was. He just needed to pull them out before the Council started pulling threads. By the second day of the warp jump, he had a team. Cress, Sable, and Hex, barely 21, who'd been caught as a teenager and earmarked for Council AI labor programs. They'd tried to rewire his mind for their systems. It didn't take. He'd walked out knowing more about their architecture than any of his handlers had intended to give him. Then there was Mira. He found her in the lower cargo hold on the second day, sitting on a supply crate like she'd been waiting. He had his weapon up before he finished processing what he was looking at. She didn't move. I was on Duvest, she said. Lower ore processing, not your 11. But I heard the meeting. How? She tapped her ear. Good hearing. Who are you? Someone who's been moving between colonies for 2 years feeding intel to the signal network. She looked at him. You're going to Veltrax 9. Yes? Good, she said. Because I know where Cipher is. The approach to Veltrax went smoother than it had any right to. Fake Zerelian credentials from a Council officer whose files Hex had extracted during his labor program time. The orbital control ran 3 systems simultaneously and didn't look closely enough. Their dock clearance in under 4 minutes. They landed on Dock 17 as cargo maintenance crew, subgroup 4. The cold outside hit like a hammer. The entire moon was carved from ancient compressed ice sheeted in industrial steel. The Council maintained it because it housed one of the most powerful relay transmitters in the outer systems. If you wanted to send a signal that couldn't be ignored, you sent it from here. 3 phases. Reach the relay core, deploy the viral payload, extract Cipher. The payload wasn't a weapon. It was a message. A signal that would wake dormant human-built relay nodes scattered across dead satellites and abandoned outposts throughout the galaxy. Nodes the Council didn't know existed because they'd never cataloged the garbage they left behind when they stripped human infrastructure. The Sable handled the access points without triggering a single sensor. Hex flooded the surveillance grid with maintenance requests, looping camera feeds with 14-minute windows of old footage. Guards saw what they'd seen an hour ago. The relay core was massive. Transmitter columns humming with a bass frequency that Ryker felt in his jaw. Hex stepped forward without being asked. 8 minutes. Payload is in, Hex said. Deployment sequence running. Nobody cheered. The signal spreading through that relay hub would find every sleeping node in the galaxy. And when those nodes woke up, they would say one thing to every human who still knew how to listen. You are not alone. You are not forgotten, Rise. Then the alarm hit. Immediate. Total. A red light flooding every corridor. A lockdown sequence repeating in Zerelian. The sound of drones spinning up. Mira's voice through the comm. They adjusted the window. We've got 30 minutes, not 90. We need cipher, she said. Prisoner block is south. They moved. The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos. Corridors that Ryker had memorized felt different in real life. Narrower, colder. Cress held the rear. Sable stayed close. Mira ran ahead like someone who'd done this many times before, taking corners without hesitation, moving through the station like she belonged in its walls. The prisoner block was a low-ceiling stretch of isolation cells near the south maintenance level. One cell wasn't empty. The figure inside was old, not just in years, old in the way people get when they've been carrying something enormous for too long. Small, thin, hair the color of ash, eyes clouded with what might have been a council-administered blindness protocol. When Ryker stepped into the doorway, those eyes turned toward him with absolute precision. Ryker Vale, the figure said. Her name was Mara. Before she became Cipher, she had been a systems architect for the Council's own communication infrastructure.
Human.
Council employed.
Trusted.
For 15 years, she had lived inside that trust like a parasite in reverse, feeding intelligence outward to resistance cells while building the exact relay architecture that Ryker's team had just used to broadcast to the galaxy. I've been watching your cell grow for 12 years, she said. Her voice was entirely steady.
You did it correctly.
Patient.
Careful.
We're rushing now, Mira said from the corridor. Ryker helped Mara to her feet. She was lighter than he expected. They ran. The South Auxiliary dock had a Zerelian patrol skiff on a magnetic clamp, unlocked. Her full fuel cells. Not everyone made it to it. Hex was at the rear when the corridor sealed under an emergency door that came down faster than the schematics showed. He didn't come through. Ryker sat with that for a long time, staring at the stars outside the viewport as the skiff punched through Veltrax 9's atmosphere. Mara sat in the co-pilot seat wrapped in a heating blanket. What did we just send? Ryker asked. A reminder that we exist, she said. And something else. Something I buried in the payload 16 years ago. The Council's original file on Earth. Ryker went still. They have a file? They have everything, she said. Every decision, every vote, every internal summary. She looked at him. They didn't destroy Earth because they hated humanity. They destroyed it because they were afraid of what humanity was becoming. The skiff drifted into deep space. Behind them, Veltrax 9 blazed with Council response ships. Ahead, the stars were impossibly quiet. And across the galaxy, in gutters and work camps and stolen ships, humans lifted their heads. Mara died on the 4th day. She had been kept alive by Council-issued neural suppressants as a kind of slow leverage. When they identified her as Cipher 2 weeks before Ryker arrived, they simply stopped the supply. She held on long enough to see the signal confirmed. She died looking at the stars. Ryker sat with her for an hour after. Sable came in and sat down without saying anything. There were no words for it. Mara had spent 15 years feeding intelligence from inside the Council's own architecture. She had probably saved hundreds of lives that would never know her name. And she had died in a stolen skiff in the middle of nowhere, wrapped in a heating blanket. The least Ryker could do was sit. On the 5th day, a signal came through, encrypted, old format binary, 12 words, rally point, station EOS 7, 1 week, Vale leads. He had not sent that signal. Mira was at the navigation terminal when he told her. She didn't react for a moment. You're not the only network, she said. He looked at her. Are you going? He thought about Mara, about the way she'd looked at him in that cell. You did it correctly.
Yes,
he said. EOS 7 was not what Ryker expected. He'd been told it was a decommissioned science station. It's technically accurate. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was that over the past year and a half it had become the single largest gathering point for the human resistance in the known galaxy. When they broke through the outer ring, Ryker saw hundreds of ships. Every configuration imaginable. Scrap-built. Zerelian hulls re-engineered with human cores. Council transport vessels seized and repurposed with considerable creativity. Ships that had no business flying together were docked side by side on every available surface. There were so many that they formed a second hull around the station itself, all of them flying the same banner, a flame, orange and white, simple, unmistakable. When Ryker walked through the airlock, people stopped working. A man with burn scars across most of his face came to attention. Not a military salute, something more like acknowledgement. A recognition passed between them without words. A group of children stared at him from behind a bulkhead, their eyes wide and unafraid in a way that surprised him. He'd been around children who flinched at unexpected sounds. These ones didn't. A mechanic dropped a tool, picked it up again, and whispered his name like a prayer. He wasn't ready for it. He kept walking. The command center was in the old research hub at the station's core. Banks of screens and data terminals, most of them salvaged and mismatched, running a patchwork of surveillance feeds, troop movement maps, intercepted council communications, and logistics coordinates. Chaotic to look at. Extremely functional. The kind of chaos that has been organized by someone who thinks faster than the environment around them. In the center stood a woman, tall, a coat that had been through actual combat, the left sleeve scorched along the elbow, a gray streak above her left temple. She stood like someone who had long ago decided that the concept of comfort was not a priority. She looked at Ryker when he walked in. "You're late," she said. "I didn't know I was invited," he replied. Something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly. More like the specific acknowledgement of someone who has been watching a situation develop for a long time and has finally arrived at the moment they were preparing for. Her name was Commander Seya, Earthborn. She'd been 12 when the Council burned New Berlin from orbit. She'd watched it through a refugee ship viewport, pressed against the cold glass in the dark. She'd spent the 4 decades since doing something about it. Every single day of them. "Veltrax shook things," she said without preamble. "The broadcast is spreading faster than the Council can suppress. Confirmed contacts in 42 systems. 3 Council governorships have gone dark." She turned to the main display. A supply route stretching across 6 star systems, gold and blue. The Meridian Vein. "Their primary weapons supply line to the outer war fleets," she said. "We cut it. They lose fuel and logistical coherence. We have override codes, schedule data, and agents embedded in their transport crews for 2 years. She looked at Ryker. "Their biggest flaw is pride. They think this route is untouchable. They think humans are chaos." He studied the map. "What do we have that they don't?" he asked. She smiled, not warm, but real. "Humans who have nothing left to lose," she said, "and everything to prove. What do you think happens when patience finally runs out? Drop it in the comments below. We read every single one." The days before the Meridian strike were grinding and technical. Old weapons came out of cold storage. Ryker watched a 15-year-old girl disassemble a Zerelian plasma cannon in 60 seconds and reassemble it with a modification she'd designed herself. He watched Mira train new fighters with blank focus and noticed that the people she trained stopped being afraid around the 3rd day. The night before they launched, Sable found him on the upper observation deck. "You think about them?" she asked. "Hex, Mara." "All the time," he said. "Good." "You should." She looked at the stars. "The hard ones break eventually. The ones who feel it, they last." She stood up, patted his shoulder once, and walked back inside. The fleet launched in silence, 39 ships, some barely spaceworthy. All crewed by people who understood exactly what they were walking into. They dropped out of warp at the edge of the Meridian Vein. Seya's voice came through the fleet channel. No speeches, just fire. Ryker flew a retrofitted interceptor he'd named Dustwalker. It had been a Council scout vessel until someone stripped its transponder, rewired its weapons array, and replaced its navigation system with human-built components that responded faster because they'd been built by people who were angry. Hex's last gift activated at the start of the engagement. Those emergency channels hijacked with ghost distress calls that pulled Council reserves out of position. The convoy was exposed for 11 minutes. Ryker flew through the center of it. He saw the Council's formation try to regroup. Saw the precision of the most powerful military force in the known galaxy trying to adapt to something it had never faced. Not a frontal assault, not an ambush, an organism, dozens of small ships making independent decisions based on shared purpose rather than central command. The Council had no tactical response for that, because no species had ever given them one before. 3 hours and 14 minutes. When it ended, 31 Council ships were drifting in the dark. The Meridian vein severed at 3 points. Supply convoys destroyed. The rebellion had lost 14 ships, 308 people. Ryker sat in the Dustwalker's cockpit for a long time after. The view screen cracked. A smell in the cabin he didn't want to identify. His hands had stopped shaking somewhere around the 90-minute mark, and he couldn't quite remember when. He closed his eyes and saw the faces of the people who had signed on to those 14 ships.
Volunteers.
People who had looked at the odds, understood them completely, and decided that the odds were not the point. That had never been the point. He opened his eyes. The stars were still there, the way they always were. The Council's statement came 6 hours later. Terrorist ambush. The stolen technology, isolated extremist event, no threat to galactic order. But their communication traffic had changed, more encrypted, more frequent, pauses where there hadn't been pauses before. The kind of pauses that come from people who are trying to figure out how to explain something they were told couldn't happen. They were afraid. They were trying very hard not to look like it. And across the galaxy, in places the Council's public channels would never reach, footage from Meridian was spreading, showing a convoy the Council had considered untouchable burning in the dark, dismantled by a fleet of rust and salvage and human fury. Their victory has a texture to it that Ryker hadn't expected. Not clean. Something cracked open, and you're not sure what's inside. They moved base to Carthus, an abandoned moon on the edge of a collapsed gas giant's debris field. A former trading port the Council had made an example of 2 decades earlier. Now it was being rebuilt, not just as a base, as a city. Families had arrived, people who had been following the signal and didn't know where else to go. The rebellion was becoming something else, something larger. Seya ran operations from the Central Command Block, precise, efficient, relentlessly focused. Ryker respected her enormously, which is why it hit harder when Sable brought him the file. It came through a technical review of data from a Council intelligence node 3 days after Meridian, buried under 6 encryption levels: voice identification, behavioral pattern analysis, a profile record. The profile name was Asset Thornwood. The voice matched Seya Drant. Ryker sat in the cold dark of the lower comm room for 2 hours reading it. 15 years of contact records. Strategic intelligence passed between the rebellion and the Council. Not enough to destroy the movement, enough to shape it. To ensure that the unpredictable cells got surfaced to Council attention through data that looked accidental. Sable confirmed the biometric ID 3 times. It was her. In the morning, Seya called a Council meeting in the main hangar. She reported the Council's retreat, the supply line disruptions, the breakdown of outer sector control. The room responded with the cautious energy of people who had been losing for a long time and had finally found something that looked like a turning point. Then she looked at Ryker. "Tell them what we found," she said. He met her eyes. She was watching him with complete steadiness. No tell. No flinch. She already knew he knew. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he talked about Meridian outcomes, about the strategic window it had created. Later, alone in the corridor, he faced her. "You've been feeding them intelligence on our people," he said. "I've been feeding them intelligence on the elements that would have turned this movement into something we couldn't survive," she said, voice absolute. "The factions planning mass reprisals. The cells building weapons for civilian targets, leaders organizing around personal power. I gave the Council names that kept us alive and directed." He stared at her. "You don't get to make that decision." "Then who does?" she said. "I've been in this for 30 years. She held his eyes. "You're not ready to lead them without me." He turned and walked away. He didn't sleep again that night. What made the decision for him happened 2 days later. The Council struck Delvar 6, a colony the rebellion had helped stabilize 6 months earlier, mostly agricultural, families who had been Zerelian labor workers trying to build something like a life. The Council glassed it from orbit, 23,000 dead. When the transmission fragments arrived at Carthus, the station went quiet. Not the quiet of a pause, the quiet of something breaking. Ryker stood on the landing platform. The stars were there, the way they always were. He heard Mara's voice. You must make them remember Earth. He called an open meeting on the landing deck, under open stars. Over 200 came. He told them about the file, about Seya, about what she'd done and why. He watched grief and anger and betrayal move through the crowd like a visible thing. Then he said what he thought. She didn't do it for the council. She did it because she didn't trust us. She thought we needed to be managed. She thought humans couldn't be trusted with their own revolution. He paused. You cannot build something real on selected truth. You cannot lead people by deciding what they're allowed to know about themselves. That's what the council does. And if we do it to each other, then Earth really did die. Not in the bombardment. Right here. Mira stepped up beside him. She gave orders that got people killed, Mira said. Not loudly, just clearly. Not in battle. Internal discipline actions, people who questioned her direction. An old fighter named Corvan stood up. I want to see the file. It's available, Ryker said. All of it. By morning, Seya was gone. Her quarters were empty. Just a message on Ryker's private channel. You win, Vale. Don't waste what I built. He stood in her quarters looking at the absence of her. He didn't know what to feel about Seya Drant. He wasn't sure he ever would. What he knew was that the rebellion had just survived its first test that had nothing to do with the council. They asked him to lead. He thought about it for 6 hours. Then he said yes. 3 conditions. No military campaigns without full council review, no violence against civilian populations of any species, and every leader without exception would spend 1 season out of every 3 living among the people they claimed to represent, not observing, living, working, eating what was available. Several people hated the 3rd condition. He held firm. The ones who stayed began building something that hadn't existed before. The next phase was not a war. It was a heist. The Rebel Council understood something important. They could not defeat the Galactic Council through direct military engagement alone. The Council's core fleets were still enormous, still capable of glassing planets. What the rebellion needed was something no fleet could answer, something that spread faster than suppression, the truth. Specifically the truth about Earth. Mira had told Ryker before she died that the Council's complete historical vault was buried beneath Zerith Prime, every decision, every vote, every war order, including a file she had discovered and hidden inside their own system 16 years earlier. A file labeled Exodus, True Cause. Ryker assembled a small team, himself, Mira, Sable, a demolitions specialist named Carr, and a Vari defector named Kale. The Vari were a species the Council had spent 30 years pacifying, tall, scaled, eyes like polished obsidian, once a warrior culture. The Council had banned their traditions, erased their history, forced them into administrative service. Kale had watched his own father executed for refusing to burn their ancestral scrolls. He didn't speak much. When he did, the words mattered. And Ryker trusted him more than most humans he'd known for years. The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in practice. Enter Zerith Prime as diplomatic envoys, the representatives of the Calethra Unified Territories, a political faction the Council had buried so completely that most current officials had never heard of it. Kale provided access credentials. Ryker decided not to ask how. They landed in broad daylight. The city was everything described. Beautiful, ordered, peaceful in the specific way of a place where decisions about who gets peace are made quietly and far away. Ryker walked through streets that smelled of processed flowers and felt a slow, quiet anger the whole way. Every door opened, every scanner showed green. Every council official walked past the service workers without looking twice. The archive was deep, significantly below the public structures. The vault was enormous and cold and smelled like time. Rows of data spires extending to the ceiling, each containing more history than any person could read in a lifetime. History the Council had decided to own. Sable worked the interface in silence, layers of encryption pushed back against every tool she applied. 8 minutes. I'm in, she said. The central directory projection filled the vault with light. File after file. Bureaucratic labels, species assessment protocols, incident classifications. In one folder, buried under 4 encryption layers labeled simply Exodus, True Cause. Open it, Ryker said. When it opened, the room went quiet. A recording played automatically, a council chamber, 12 figures in a circle, voices precise and calm. One figure spoke about Earth's advancement rate, AI containment failing, genetic modification spreading without oversight. Humanity cracking dark matter compression in 80 years, when no species in recorded galactic history had managed it in under 500. Another voice, if left unchecked, they destabilized the galactic balance in 2 generations. We stop them now. A third unanimous, silence. Then unanimous, glass the planet, frame it as internal collapse, erase their history, scatter the survivors, let them degrade into irrelevance. Ryker stood very still for a long time. Mira's fists were closed at her sides. Kael had turned his face away from the projection. Sable's voice was barely a whisper. They were afraid of what we were becoming. They broke us before we could rise, Ryker said. He looked at her. Copy everything. She was already copying it. Then the alarms hit. 9 minutes of controlled emergency. Sable routed the data to a secure channel on a broadcast time delay. Carr held the access corridor. Kael guided them through maintenance tunnels that only Avari would know to look for. His people had built significant portions of Zerith's infrastructure back when they still had a choice about it. They reached the subdock level as Council dropships began landing. They took a ship. They flew it away from Zerith Prime at maximum acceleration. 3 hours after departure, the broadcast activated. The Exodus file complete and unedited, every voice, every vote. The full decision to murder a species because it was developing too quickly, spread across every open channel, every pirate frequency, every resistance terminal, every black market data stream in the known galaxy. The galaxy could not unsee it. The Council's denial protocols activated within hours. Fake footage, counter-narratives, expert spokespersons warning about fabricated evidence. But the people had already heard the voices, 12 voices saying unanimous. On dozens of worlds, something changed. The species that had been watching from a careful distance began making different calculations. The Vari issued a formal statement of solidarity. Plantari worker collectives walked off their posts. Even within Zerelian society, younger generations began asking questions out loud. The Council had built its empire on controlling the story. It had just lost control of the story. At Karthus, Ryker sat on the observation deck with Mira. They were afraid of us, she said. They should have been, he said. She looked at him. And now? He watched the stars. Now they should be afraid for a different reason, he said. The months that followed were the hardest, not because of fighting, because of everything else. The rebellion had grown into something Ryker could no longer hold in his head all at once. New ships arriving daily. A new species deciding that the Council's logic of planetary elimination was a logic they also recognized from their own histories. The Ember Accord was built on equal voice, one representative per joining world, every decision through transparent debate, no executive overrides, messy, slow. Sometimes infuriating real. Corvan objected to alien representation, argued it loudly with people behind him who had survived the purges and carried in their bodies the physical record of what the Zerelians had done. Ryker understood that. He also knew what it meant to build the same structure that had destroyed them and call it by a different name. If we do to them what they did to us, he told Corvan, then we've already lost. Corvan took 40 fighters and left. Ryker watched them go. The final campaign had a name, Ashlight. Mira suggested it one morning and nobody asked her to explain it. It fit. Light through ash. The ember of something that refuses to go out. The goal was not annihilation. The hardest argument Ryker had to make. To the people who had lost families in council strikes. To the children who had grown up in labor colonies on moons without names. All with perfectly legitimate reasons to want the Council's leadership fed to the same judgment it had applied to others. The goal was accountability. The fleet that launched was larger than Meridian, multi-species, crewed by people who had never served together before, working out in real time what it meant to fight alongside someone with a completely different relationship to what they were fighting for. They arrived at Haler. The Council's response came immediately. Over 80 vessels, including 3 Dreadnought-class warships, the same type used at Earth. Massive. Perfect. Terrifying through a sensor suite. Ryker took a breath. Sable's voice through the comm. "Ready? Always?" he said. 7 hours. Sable held one of the Council's flanking movements long past the point where it should have broken through. Kale led the Vari assault on the upper orbital ring and held a Zerelian command ship for 40 minutes. Mira moved through the ruins of a Council listening post with the same efficiency she'd always had. At one point they were back-to-back in a tight corridor. She said quietly, "Still here." "Still here," he said. The Council flagship went down in the 7th hour. Supreme Chancellor Alentar Voss, whose voice had been one of the 12 in the Exodus recording, died with his ship. His last transmission was static. When it ended, the channel went quiet. Ryker sat in the Dustwalker's cockpit. He did not feel what he'd expected. He felt tired. He felt the weight of the people not sitting in cockpits anymore. He felt the hollow quality of an ending that doesn't resolve into anything clean. Sable's voice in his earpiece.
"Ryker?"
"It's done." He looked at the stars.
"Yeah,"
he said. They held a day of silence at Carthus. No speeches. No orders, just grief. The right kind. Sable was one of the people who didn't come back. She'd rerouted core power to hold a failing shield wall. She'd known what it would do. She'd done it anyway. Ryker stood in her quarters looking at the things she'd left behind. A photograph, a few tools. A small handmade object he didn't recognize. Some people leave very little trace. Sable had been one of the truest people he'd ever known. What remains after a war is not peace. Not immediately. What remains is space. Empty space where urgency used to be. And in that space, all the questions the fighting had been holding at bay come walking through. What are we building? Who gets to build it? What do we owe the ones who joined us? The Ember Accord met daily, sometimes for 12 hours. Ryker listened more than he spoke. He had spent enough time making decisions that cost other people their lives. The new laws were simple. No species could hold authority over another. All historical records accessible to all member worlds. Military action required full Accord consensus. Every leader, without exception, would spend 1 season in 3 living among the people they claimed to represent, not observing, living, working. Corvan's warband resurfaced 8 months into the quiet year. They struck a refugee convoy and killed 12 Vari children, and left a message communicating their vision of a future without alien species. Mira led the response. She came back without a word, sat next to Ryker in the corridor, handed him an insignia still warm. He looked at it. "Clean?" he asked.
"Clean enough," she said.
He nodded. What came after was not what Ryker had imagined during the years of waiting. He had expected reconstruction to be hard. He had not expected it to be beautiful. On Vexen 4, former labor workers were building a city from repurposed council infrastructure. On Duves 3, the copper veins humans had dug for decades were being rerouted to fund a school. On a dozen worlds the council had classified as resource deposits, people were naming things. Hills, rivers, moons overhead, giving them names and teaching those names to children who had never had them before. There is something specific about naming things. It says, "This is ours. We are here. We intend to stay." Ryker traveled, no armor, usually no weapon. He walked through market squares and building sites and talked to people. Some cried when they saw him. Some shook his hand. Some just nodded. The same nod he'd given people in cargo bays years ago. The one that meant, "I see you. I know what this cost." He met a man on Carthus who had been a dishwasher in a Zerelian station for 19 years. He was now running the city's water reclamation program. He didn't want to talk about the war. He wanted to talk about his daughter's first day at the new school. Ryker sat with him for 2 hours and listened to every word. He met a group of engineers on one of the former moon colonies. They were designing a structure, not a weapon, not a defense installation, a library. An open archive of human history, Earth history, pre-bombardment records that had survived in fragments in private hands for decades, now being gathered into one place that anyone could walk into. One afternoon on Vexen 4, a child ran up to him. Half human, half Plantari.
Small.
Eyes enormous and steady. She held up something she'd made herself. A banner stitched from scraps of council uniform fabric and old Earth military cloth. The symbol was a flame, small and warm. Beneath it, words in 3 languages. From patience came fire. From fire came light. Ryker knelt down. Took the banner, held it. He wasn't sure when he started crying. He didn't try to stop it. Some things you earn the right to feel without managing them. Mira appeared at his shoulder at some point, stood quietly beside him the way she'd stood quietly beside him for years. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He finally looked up. The child had run off to something else. Children do that. They hand you something enormous and go play. He stood. Time to hand it off? Mira asked. Getting close, he said. What do you think it really means to build something after everything is burned? Leave it in the comments. Every response gets read. Her name was Trell Vashta, former council technical worker. And very, by species with a mind that processed tactical and ethical complexity in ways Ryker had never quite matched. She'd been a labor slave for the council's AI programs until she was 22. She'd spent the years since building something completely different, 31 years old. Better suited to lead the Ember Accord than Ryker had ever been. He called a full session. He stood at the front and kept it short. The movement had never been about him. He'd lit something and tried not to let the fire burn everything that mattered. The task now required patience of a different kind, the patience of building rather than surviving. That was Trell's kind of patience, not his. He took his insignia off and placed it on the table. She picked it up. He walked out. He took a small ship. No crew, no guards, no destination. Just himself, and the silence and the stars and the particular quiet of someone who has been running towards something for so long that stopping feels like falling at first. He thought about Earth sometimes, not the Earth of recordings, the Earth that might have been, green and wet and blue, unmarked by orbital fire, a planet that had been learning to know itself, had been building something extraordinary, when someone in a room with 12 chairs looked at what was growing and decided it was too much. That it needed to be ended before it could become what it was going to become. He thought about Mara, about the patience of living inside the enemy's architecture for 15 years, feeding truth outward in fragments, waiting for the moment when fragments were enough. She had never seen the result. She had died in a stolen skiff wrapped in a heating blanket, not knowing for certain whether any of it would work. She had done it anyway. That was the thing about Mara. She didn't need to see the outcome to commit to the action. He thought about Sable and her particular quiet courage. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just keeps showing up. He thought about Hex, barely 21, who had left his last gift inside a viral payload and then let a corridor door close between himself and the rest of them. Ryker still thought about that moment. The specific way it had happened. No final words, no dramatic gesture, just a door sealing shut, and the absence of someone who had been there a second before. He thought about KL, who had joined a human rebellion because he recognized the shape of what had been done to his own people, who had guided them through maintenance tunnels on Zerith Prime, that his people had built back when they still had a choice about it. There was something in that detail that Ryker turned over often. The Council had used Vari labor to build the vault that stored the evidence of the Council's own crimes. History is full of that kind of irony. He thought about Mira, still alive somewhere, still making sure things worked. She'd always been better at the ongoing work than the dramatic gesture. He respected that enormously, more than he'd ever told her, which was a failure he acknowledged privately and hoped was not entirely unforgivable. He thought about the child on Vexen 4. He drifted through the outer rim systems, not going anywhere specific, just moving. The way you move when you've been aimed at something for so long that when the aiming stops, you have to remember what it feels like to exist without a direction. It takes longer than you'd think. The muscle memory of urgency doesn't release easily. Then one morning, drifting past a small system with 2 moons and no name in any council registry, he stopped the ship, sat at the viewport, watched the light from a distant sun fall across the curve of a planet he'd never been to. green along the coasts, blue where the oceans were. It was alive. He wondered if it had rain. He wondered if it had trees. He sat there for a long time. For the first time in many years, the silence around him didn't feel like the silence before something terrible. It felt like the silence after something necessary. The quiet that comes in when the noise ends and the slow, unglamorous, essential work can begin. Not the work of burning things, the work of building things that deserve to last. He had burned things. He had not burned everything. Somewhere behind him, across the stars, the Ember Accord was meeting. Representatives from 43 worlds arguing about things that mattered. Children learning the real history of Earth in open classrooms. The Vari rebuilding their cultural archive. The library on that moon colony filling with records that had been hidden in private hands for decades. Former enemies becoming something more complicated than enemies. Not always harmony, but something real. Ryker sat with that. He sat with it until the distant sun moved across the sky of that unnamed planet and the blue of the oceans shifted into something richer and deeper as the light changed angle. The stars sang, the way they always had. Before the signal, before the rebellion, before the fire, before Earth. They had been singing when humanity first looked up at them. They had been singing when the council made its decision in that room with 12 chairs. They would still be singing long after every name in this story had faded into the larger record of things that happened and mattered and were remembered. That was enough. His name was Ryker Vale. He had been patient. Then he had been awake. Now finally he was free. And across the galaxy, in the quiet moments between one thing and the next, people remembered a word that had once been a joke, then a warning, then a battle cry, and was now, slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of work still ahead, becoming something else entirely, human.